Remember those genius cooking tricks that worked like magic but vanished from our kitchens? They made simple meals stretch, shine, and satisfy in ways today's cookbooks forgot. Why did we ever stop using them? Cold water pie crust was the kind of trick that did not need fancy words or modern instructions. You used flour, lard, a little salt, and water so cold it could numb your fingers. That was it. No refrigeration, no butter cubes, and definitely no food processor. Cooks would stir it just until it held together, then roll it thin and let it rest right on the countertop. The cold water kept the lard from melting too early, so when it hit the oven, the crust puffed and flaked just right. It was soft in the middle, crisp at the edges, and you could slice it clean even after it cooled. These pies were never about elegance. They were about making do, impressing no one but keeping the family full. That pie might hold stewed apples or onions and potatoes, or a mix of beans and leftover meat. Either way, it worked. You cannot find this in modern cookbooks because no one wants to talk about how powerful a glass of ice water and a bit of patience used to be. It was not glamorous, but it was genius. Flour and salt meat stretchers were not about taste. They were about survival and smart thinking. When a pound of meat had to feed 6 or 7 people, there was no room for waste. Home cooks would mix the meat with a cup or 2 of flour, sometimes seasoned with pepper or dried herbs, and add a heavy pinch of salt. That mixture got turned into patties, crumbles, or meatballs. The flour made it stick together, and the salt helped pull out the flavor from the scraps of beef or pork. Sometimes an egg was added, sometimes not. Fried in a pan or baked in a loaf tin, it held its shape and filled the plate. Kids did not ask what was in it. They were just glad to have a warm dinner with something meaty at the center. These stretchers kept food on the table long after the groceries had run out. You will not find this trick in today's glossy cookbooks. Nobody wants to admit that flour can make meat go twice as far, but ask anyone who lived through the hard years, and they will tell you it was a trick worth knowing. Evaporated milk whipped cream was the sort of dessert trick passed between neighbors, not down through cookbooks. When cream was too expensive or just plain missing from the fridge, you reached for that dented can of evaporated milk in the back of the cupboard. You chilled it until it was ice cold, sometimes freezing it for 10 minutes, and then beat it with a whisk or mixer until it fluffed up. If you added a little sugar and a drop of vanilla, you almost could not tell the difference. It would not hold shape as long as the real thing, but it made a bowl of canned peaches or gelatin salad feel like a special treat. Children did not care if it came from a cow or a can. If it looked creamy, that was enough. You could even fold it into puddings or layer it in trifles. The trick was to keep everything cold and to know when to stop mixing. Today's cookbooks skip this entirely. They assume everyone has heavy cream or will just buy whipped topping. But the old way worked just fine, and it felt like magic every time it turned out right. Bacon grease jar cooking was not just a habit, it was a household rule. You never threw out bacon fat, not once. It was poured hot into a tin can or a glass jar, usually kept by the stove, and reused for just about everything. Fried potatoes, sautéed greens, biscuits brushed on top for that golden shine. Some families even swore by it for making popcorn. It added flavor where there was none and stretched what little fat you had across the whole week. Bacon grease turned bland cabbage into something rich and smoky. It revived day-old cornbread and crisped up onions like nothing else. The jar was never labeled, and no one needed it to be. You just knew what it was by the smell. Today, we are told to throw away fat and use olive oil instead. But back then, this was gold. It was seasoning, substance, and thrift all in one. And even though it is missing from most cookbooks now, that old bacon jar still lives on in a few quiet kitchens that remember its worth. Dough fluffing with vinegar and baking soda was one of those chemistry tricks that made you feel like a magician in the kitchen. No eggs? No problem. A splash of vinegar in your batter, mixed with baking soda, gave just enough lift to make pancakes, muffins, or quick breads rise like they had all the right ingredients. It fizzed as soon as you stirred it in, and you had to work fast. Those bubbles did not last forever. But if you timed it right, You got a tender crumb and a soft center without needing eggs or even milk. It was a lifesaver when rationing hit or when payday was still a few days away. Vinegar was cheap, baking soda was shelf-stable, and together they turned nothing into something. Modern recipes tend to leave this out, pushing people toward eggs or dairy substitutes. But vinegar and soda were the real original hack. They worked quietly, without a fuss, and gave families hot breakfasts and passable cakes even in the leanest times. Pan-toasting stale bread for crumb coating was not just clever, it was essential. You did not throw out old bread. You let it dry, you crumbled it with your fingers, and you tossed it into a hot skillet to toast. No oil, no butter, just dry heat. The smell alone was comforting, warm, nutty, toasty in a way that made you feel like something good was coming. Once browned, you could crush it finer and use it to coat fish, chicken, or vegetables before frying. Or sprinkle it on casseroles to give them a crisp top layer. It gave texture and taste to anything soft or soggy. Kids who grew up on this trick remember the sound of that skillet scraping across the stovetop more than they remember store-bought breadcrumbs. Today, most people buy theirs in boxes, but those never taste quite the same. Pan-toasted crumbs were a small act of resourcefulness, born from the kind of hunger that made you see potential in every stale slice. Potato boil water for gravy base is one of those tricks that feels too simple to matter, until you taste it. When you boil potatoes, the water turns cloudy and thick with starch. Most people pour it down the drain, but the old cooks saved it. That cloudy water was liquid gold, perfect for thickening gravies, stews, or even making a quick roux without needing butter or flour. It added body and just a hint of potato flavor, which paired beautifully with meat scraps or leftover vegetables. It was warm, filling, and somehow made everything else taste richer. You could stir in pan drippings or a spoonful of mustard or vinegar and have something that passed for a real sauce. Nothing fancy, but deeply satisfying. This trick barely shows up in cookbooks today, even though it worked better than some of the thickeners you find on store shelves. It was a quiet skill, one you learned by watching, not by reading. And once you knew it, you never threw out potato water again. Skillet roasting coffee beans at home was an act of love and patience. Before electric roasters and fancy blends, families would buy green coffee beans in bulk and roast them right in their kitchens. A heavy cast iron skillet was all you needed. You kept the beans moving constantly to prevent burning, usually shaking the pan or stirring with a long spoon over medium heat. The smell was smoky, earthy, and almost intoxicating. You had to listen closely for the first crack, that sharp popping sound that told you the roast was beginning. Some people liked a lighter roast, others waited for a darker color and fuller aroma. Once cooled, sometimes wrapped in a damp towel, they were ground by hand or in a manual grinder and brewed fresh. It was a whole process, but it made your morning cup feel earned. Today's coffee comes pre-roasted, pre-ground, and sealed in plastic. But back then, roasting your own beans was a skill that saved money, deepened flavor, and filled the house with the kind of smell that told you the day was starting right. Ketchup meat marinades were the unsung heroes of tough cuts. If the meat was chewy or on the edge of spoiling, ketchup was your best bet. Mixed with vinegar, onions, and sometimes a bit of sugar, it created a tangy brine that broke down fibers and gave the meat a richer taste. The acidity worked like magic, especially overnight in the icebox, or even just an hour before cooking. Frying or grilling after a ketchup soak gave the meat a caramelized crust and a deep savory flavor that covered up any flaws. It was a go-to for cheap steaks, pork scraps, and even liver. Some families added garlic or mustard, others kept it plain. Either way, it was dependable. You will not find this trick in high-end recipes or modern cookbooks, but it worked so well that it stayed in rotation for decades. Ketchup was more than a condiment. It was a tool. And for a lot of families, it turned subpar meat into something you actually looked forward to. Homemade rennet for cheesemaking was not for the faint of heart, but it got the job done. Before tablets and store-bought cultures, people used what they had, often vinegar, lemon juice, or for the brave ones, a bit of calf stomach lining. The process was part science, part tradition. You warmed milk gently, stirred in the curdling agent, and waited for the magic to happen. Once it separated into curds and whey, you strained it through cloth and pressed it into soft rounds or blocks. Some added salt or herbs, others kept it plain. The taste was fresh, a little tangy, and deeply rewarding. It was not just about saving money, it was about knowing how to make food from the ground up. Today's cookbooks mostly skip this, expecting readers to start with pre-made cheese or kits. But the old method taught patience and respect for the process. Cheese was no longer something you bought, it was something you made. Dry mustard rubs were more than just a way to flavor meat. They were a quiet method of preservation long before refrigerators took over. A generous dusting of dry mustard, often mixed with salt, pepper, and a few pantry spices, was rubbed deep into cuts of pork, beef, or even game. The mix helped dry the surface, seal in juices, and gave the meat a subtle bite that came alive once cooked. These rubs worked especially well when meat had to be kept cool in a cellar or icebox and used over several days. For families who could not afford to let anything spoil, it was a little layer of safety and a whole lot of flavor. As the meat rested, the mustard acted like a protective barrier, especially in roasts or loins. When you finally cooked it, that seasoning had sunk in all the way through. Some even used mustard rubs before curing or smoking. These days, we rarely think about spices as preservers. We expect refrigeration to do the work. But back then, a tin of mustard powder was one of the most useful things in the pantry. Egg white paint for pie crust shine was the kind of kitchen trick passed down without words, just by watching someone do it. Before you had glossy photos in cookbooks or pre-made pastry shells, a good pie was known by its crust. And nothing made that crust sing like a simple swipe of beaten egg white. It gave a golden sheen, a crisp snap when bitten, and just enough polish to make it feel like a special occasion. No butter wash, no fancy glaze, just a leftover egg white, whisked and brushed on with a fingertip or scrap of cloth. It was used on both sweet and savory pies, and sometimes even on biscuits or rolls for that bakery look. You could even sprinkle sugar or seeds on top, and the egg white would help it stick. Today's recipes might tell you to use milk or yolk, but the old cooks knew egg whites gave the cleanest, crispest finish. It was quiet elegance from a cupboard that had very little to give. Cast iron lid baking was born out of necessity and kept alive by sheer determination. When families had no access to an oven, or when it was too hot to fire one up, they made do with what they had. And what they had was a heavy cast iron pot, usually with a domed lid. Flip that lid over, set it on a flame, and you had a perfectly usable griddle surface for baking bannock, soda bread, or flat cakes. Some folks even propped up the lid with bricks and piled coals on top to create an improvised oven. It took practice to keep the heat even, but the reward was hot bread on a day you thought there would be none. This method showed up in everything from log cabins to war kitchens, and it never let people down. Cast iron held heat like nothing else, and when times got tough, it doubled as bakeware, skillet, and roasting pan. The lid was more than a cover, it was a secret weapon. These tricks rarely appear in modern books, but they kept people fed for generations. Gravy powder from pan scrapings was the kind of invention that came from hunger and a good sense of timing. After roasting or frying, the browned bits at the bottom of the pan were never wasted. They were scraped, dried slowly in the oven or near the stove, and then ground into a coarse powder that could last for weeks. A spoonful stirred into hot water gave you instant gravy, no bouillon cubes, no jars, no packets. It tasted real because it was. That powder held the memory of every meal it came from. Roast chicken, seared chops, bacon ends. Some cooks even mixed it with flour and lard to make little gravy starter balls, ready to go at a moment's notice. The flavor was deep, smoky, and hard to pin down because it came from life, not a label. Today, we throw those scrapings away. We clean pans too quickly. But back then, this was the best part. It turned yesterday's effort into tomorrow's comfort. Boiled apple core pectin for jams was a brilliant example of how nothing went to waste, not even the parts most of us toss. When you peeled apples for pies, sauces, or snacks, you saved the cores and skins in a pot. Add water, bring it to a boil, and simmer it down until it became thick and sticky. That cloudy, pale liquid was pure pectin, the natural thickener that made your jams and jellies set without extra sugar or gelatin. You strained it through a cloth and saved it in jars, ready to add to the next batch of strawberry preserves or grape jelly. This trick gave structure to homemade spreads and let families stretch their fruit harvest further. It also meant that one bag of apples could serve 3 or 4 purposes, not just one. Store-bought pectin became popular later, but for many years, this was the only kind you had. The trick worked best with tart apples, especially those a little underripe. It is barely mentioned now, but it was once as essential as sugar itself in rural kitchens. Cold water shrinking for pie shells is one of those clever tricks almost lost to time. When you blind bake a pie crust, baking it without filling, it tends to puff or slump. Today, people use weights or beans to hold it in place. But back then, you would drop the shell briefly into a bowl of cold water just before baking. The sudden chill made the dough contract, hugging the pan tighter and holding its shape. It was a small act with a big result. No gadgets, no guesswork, just a bowl of cold water, a steady hand, and a bit of faith. This method worked especially well for custard pies or fruit pies that needed a crisp bottom. It also prevented bubbling and cracking, something even experienced bakers still fight with. You would not find this tip in many modern cookbooks. It was more likely to be passed from grandmother to granddaughter with a wink. Sometimes the simplest answers are the ones we forget first. Old coffee reboil with eggshells was a second chance in a cup. When fresh coffee grounds were scarce or when no one could afford to waste them, you would reuse the old grounds with a little twist. You cracked an eggshell into the pot before boiling. The shell helped settle the grit and bitterness, giving the brew a smoother, clearer taste. Sometimes you added a splash of cold water at the end to help the grounds sink even further. The result was not gourmet, but it was strong, hot, and clean. It got you through another morning. People called it cowboy coffee or camp coffee, but it was just what folks did when the tin of beans was running low. It taught you how to make something better with what little you had left. You will not find this on a fancy cafe menu. But for a long time, it was how real people started their day. Bread-soaked meatballs were a small act of genius hiding in plain sight. When you did not have enough breadcrumbs, or when the bread itself was too stale to eat, you soaked it in milk until it turned soft and fluffy. Then you mixed it into ground meat, herbs, and maybe an egg if you had one. The result? A tender, juicy meatball that held its shape without drying out. This trick also stretched your meat further, letting 1 pound do the work of 2. It came from Italian kitchens, but American homes embraced it fast. Sunday dinners, church potlucks, and penny-pinching mothers all used it. And it was not just for meatballs. You would see the same method in meatloaf and stuffed peppers too. The soaked bread kept things moist without adding weight. Modern recipes may call for panko or fancy crumbs, but this old trick still beats them all when it comes to comfort and thrift. Corncob broth for soups was one of those recipes that showed how deep American resourcefulness really went. After eating fresh corn, you did not toss the cobs. You simmered them. A big pot of water, a few bare cobs, maybe some onion or pepper if you had it. The cobs still held sweetness and starch, which thickened the broth and gave it a soft, buttery flavor. It became the perfect base for chowders, bean stews, or simple vegetable soups. Some people even froze the used cobs for winter cooking. Nothing was wasted. This trick worked especially well in the South and Midwest, where corn was king. It made your kitchen smell like summer, even in January. These days, most people would never think to keep a cob after the kernels are gone. But for those who remember, it was like getting a second meal for free. Cabbage leaf meat preservers were the poor man's parchment paper. When you had a small cut of meat and needed it to stay moist, you wrapped it in cabbage leaves. The leaves kept the juices in, added a faint sweetness, and softened up into something you could eat alongside the roast. You could bake it, steam it, or even tuck it into a skillet with a lid. The trick worked with ground meat too. stuffed cabbage rolls were just a natural evolution. It was popular among Eastern European immigrants, but caught on fast across rural America. The cabbage acted like a seal, but it was edible, cheap, and always around. People grew cabbage in their gardens and used every bit of it. Today, we use foil or fancy bags to lock in moisture, but back then, a cabbage leaf did the job just fine. Gelatin from leftover soup bones was not some fancy culinary flex. It was how you made food go further when every cent counted. After stews, roasts, or broths, the bones were simmered low and slow until the liquid turned rich and jiggly once cooled. That was your homemade gelatin. No boxed packets, no artificial flavors, just bones, water, and time. You could use it to set savory aspics, stretch stews into filling cold meals, or add body to gravies and sauces. Some families poured it into molds with vegetables or meat shreds, creating those odd but beloved gelatin loaves you still hear about. It was thrift, protein, and texture all in one bowl. When chilled, it held shape like store-bought gelatin, but with flavor and nutrition store versions could not touch. Modern recipes barely mention this anymore, maybe because the process takes patience. But for families who had little to spare, it was a quiet way to hold on to every bit of goodness the meal had to offer. Pot and pot steaming was a workaround so clever it made most kitchen gadgets look unnecessary. No steamer basket? No problem. You just nested a smaller pot or bowl inside a larger one filled with a little water, covered the whole thing tightly, and let the steam do its job. Vegetables came out soft but not soggy. Dumplings puffed up like clouds, and even old bread could be gently rewarmed without drying out. You had to keep an eye on the water level so it would not boil dry, but once you got the hang of it, this method became second nature. It was quiet cooking. No sizzling, no flipping, just warm air lifting food to the finish line. People used it for everything from puddings to tamales. Today, we buy tiered steamers and electric setups, but this old trick used what you already had. It turned basic pots into tools of precision, all without spending a dollar. And for many home cooks, that made all the difference. Wax paper butter roll storage was a simple solution with a whole lot of heart behind it. You took softened butter, mixed in whatever you had, maybe garlic, maybe parsley, maybe just a pinch of salt, and rolled it into a log using wax paper. Then it went straight into the freezer. When dinner came around, you would slice off a coin or two and melt it over hot vegetables, baked potatoes, or a skillet of greens. It felt luxurious, even when the ingredients were humble. Some people called them compound butters, but back then, they were just a practical way to stretch flavor and save time. You always had something on hand to make dinner feel a little more finished. The wax paper kept it clean, neat, and easy to slice without wasting any. It also let families portion out butter when it was rationed or in short supply. Today, we lean on spice mixes or bottled dressings. But back then, a wax paper roll of homemade butter was a quiet form of planning ahead and a small bit of comfort that waited patiently in the freezer. Onion skin dye for pickled eggs was one of those beautiful accidents that turned necessity into tradition. When eggs were hard to come by and pickling became a way to preserve what little you had, people looked for natural ways to add color and depth to the brine. Boiling onion skins, red or yellow, released pigments that stained the eggshells and even tinted the whites with subtle amber or rose tones. It was a quiet, rustic kind of beauty. No artificial dyes, no fancy techniques. Just leftover peels that most folks would have tossed. The flavor stayed the same, vinegary, firm, and savory. But the look was something else entirely. These eggs were packed into jars, gifted during holidays, or brought out when guests came over, turning frugal food into something you could be proud of. The trick is almost forgotten now, replaced by food coloring or store-bought brines. But for those who remember, it was always a little bit of magic pulled from the scraps. Powdered milk foam for dessert topping was a moment of real creativity hiding in the back of the pantry. When fresh cream or eggs were out of reach, powdered milk stepped in, and with the right touch, it fluffed into something that passed for whipped topping. You mixed the powder with cold water, chilled it down as much as possible, and beat it with sugar until it grew light and airy. Sometimes people added a splash of lemon juice or vanilla to round out the flavor. It was not quite whipped cream, but it was good enough to top a pudding, finish a Jell-O mold, or crown a square of sponge cake. And it made desserts feel finished, even if the ingredients were missing in action. Kids did not question it. They just remembered the sweet, creamy taste. It was affordable, shelf-stable, and dependable. That was the magic of it. Nobody uses powdered milk like this today, but it once stood in proudly when nothing else could. Split biscuit griddle reheat was how you made yesterday's biscuits feel like today's blessing. You took cold, slightly stale biscuits from the day before, split them open, and fried the cut sides in bacon grease or lard. The crust got crispy, the inside stayed soft, and what was once boring became suddenly hard to resist. It was quick, easy, and made the whole kitchen smell like breakfast, even if it was just leftovers. You did not need to add anything, but sometimes a dab of jam or honey made it extra special. Some folks even layered a slice of ham or fried egg between the halves for a quick sandwich, especially when mornings were rushed and food was scarce. In households where waste was not an option, this trick kept bread from the trash and put something warm on the plate. It also stretched a single batch of biscuits across more meals, more bellies, and more days. No recipe needed, just memory and muscle. Today, you will not find this move in a cooking app, but for the cooks who lived through lean times, it was just how things were done. Salt rub for crispy chicken skin was the kind of trick that worked better than it had any right to. You rubbed coarse salt into the skin of a whole chicken, thighs, breasts, wings, everything, then let it rest overnight in the icebox uncovered. The salt drew out moisture, tightened the skin, and left it primed to blister and crackle in the oven the next day. No need for basting or fancy glaze, just dry heat and a little patience. When it roasted, the skin puffed and crisped like potato chips, golden and full of flavor. Underneath, the meat stayed juicy. Some cooks even added a bit of ground pepper or paprika to the salt rub for a touch of color and spice. That contrast, crispy on the outside, tender inside, was what people remembered most. This dry brining method was passed from one cook to the next without much fuss because it just worked. Modern cookbooks talk about air chilling or convection fans, but back then it was salt and time. And it never failed to earn a seat at the Sunday dinner table. Sugar syrup canning seals were a sweet solution when real canning tools were hard to find. Before vacuum lids and pressure gauges became common, families often relied on a thick sugar syrup poured directly over fruit in jars. As the syrup cooled, it hardened just enough to create a glossy seal that kept out air, moisture, and insects. This sticky barrier helped preserve both the vibrant color and the shape of whatever was inside: juicy peaches, fresh strawberries, plums, or crisp apple slices. When you opened one of those jars in the dead of winter, the fruit still looked and tasted like summer. It wasn't perfect, but it was clever. The syrup was made with nothing more than boiled sugar and water, sometimes enhanced with a squeeze of lemon juice, a cinnamon stick, or a clove for a whisper of spice. While wax sealing was also common, syrup was simpler and added flavor. It was a preservation method born out of creativity, one that turned humble pantry staples into long-lasting comfort. Today, you won't find this in many modern cookbooks or safety guides, but in hard times, it was one of many tricks that brought color and sweetness to a season that offered neither. Mayonnaise cake moisture hack was a quiet baking miracle that nobody saw coming, until they tasted it. In lean times, when you didn't have fresh eggs, butter, or milk, you reached for a spoonful of mayonnaise. It sounds bizarre today, but back then, it was a stroke of culinary genius. Mayonnaise is, after all, just egg yolk, vinegar, and oil. Exactly the building blocks a cake needs to rise and stay moist. When mixed into a chocolate batter, it transformed the crumb into something soft, rich, and almost fudge-like. Even picky eaters didn't know the secret. You could serve it at birthdays, potlucks, or even Sunday suppers, and not a soul would guess what was inside. It worked with lemon cake, spice cake, even banana bread in a pinch. It didn't matter what brand you used, store-bought or homemade, it all added the right kind of richness. Long before vegan substitutions and plant-based baking went mainstream, People used what they had and made it work. Some families kept the recipe secret. Others passed it down proudly. Either way, this strange little trick proved that resourcefulness could taste like celebration and that a spoonful of something unexpected could bring joy to the table. Soup jar layering was what you did when the fridge was filled with almost empty pots and bowls. It wasn't a fancy technique, it was survival with a creative twist. When you had a little bit of leftover vegetable soup, a spoonful of bean chili, half a cup of chicken noodle, and a ladle of creamy tomato, you didn't throw any of it out. You poured them, one on top of the other, into a glass jar. The layers formed colorful stripes: green, red, yellow, beige. Some families even called it striped stew. Once the jar was full, it went into the fridge. And when it was time to reheat, you dumped the whole thing into a pot and stirred gently over low heat. The flavors blended, clashed, or occasionally surprised you. Sometimes you discovered a new favorite. Other times, it just tasted like Thursday. But it always felt thrifty. Each jar was a record of the week's meals: what was served, what was saved, and what was never wasted. In homes where food stretched far and memories were short, these jars did more than hold soup. They told a story, and in their quiet, unglamorous way, they made the most of everything. Jelly omelets were the kind of oddball depression dish that worked better than expected. Eggs were easier to get than meat, especially if you had chickens, but they still had to stretch. So when there was no bacon or sausage, people got creative. They spread jam or jelly inside a folded omelet and served it like breakfast dessert. Grape, apple, strawberry, whatever you had, often homemade and preserved. It was sweet, soft, and oddly satisfying. The egg and sugar made something that felt like a treat, even if it was born of necessity. For children, it was special. For adults, it was just another way to avoid waste. You could swap in stewed fruit or mashed banana if jelly was gone. It was quick, flexible, and checked every box for a depression meal. It might seem strange today, but it made sense back then. When food was limited, taste mattered more than rules. Fried cornmeal mush cakes were born from the same pot twice. You would make cornmeal mush, just cornmeal, water, maybe a pinch of salt, let it set in a pan overnight, and slice it into firm pieces the next day. Then you fried those slices in grease until the edges crisped up like polenta. It was crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, and just enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something indulgent. Back in the 1930s, this was how you stretched a single meal into two. The mush might have been dinner one night and breakfast the next morning. Some people served it with syrup or molasses, while others went savory and added onions or lard. There was no right or wrong. It was all about using what was left. You did not throw anything out, especially not a whole pot of cooled mush. It became a habit, a ritual, even a comfort. Children would dunk the crispy slices in milk or eat them straight from the pan. It was Depression-era cooking at its most honest. Plain ingredients, repurposed with care, turned into something worth looking forward to. You don't actually need to go to Shein for every shopping haul. It's so much more affordable to buy generic brands or local brands from designers and small businesses instead of overpriced thrifted articles that they've either gotten from some really questionable labor or what they've bought from the same people I'm talking about, but are now reselling at, like, thrice the price. It's a death trap. And I like you, viewer. I don't want you falling for it any more than you and I already have. Trust me, you'll still look just as good, if not better. Salt-rubbed chicken skin crisping is one of those old-school tricks you try once and wonder why you ever stopped. Before non-stick pans and convection ovens, getting crispy skin was a real feat. One of the simplest ways to get there? Salt. Not a pinch, but a full rub down with coarse salt, left overnight in the fridge. It drew out moisture, dried the skin, and left it ready to blister and brown. You could add garlic or herbs if you had them, but you really did not need to. The trick worked best on whole chickens or thighs with the skin on. When it came out right, the skin cracked like a chip and packed serious flavor. Cookbooks from the 1940s through the 1970s praised it under crispy chicken secrets and roast tips. It took a little planning, sure, but the reward was worth it. And best of all, it cost nothing. Pickled beet eggs looked almost too strange to eat, but they were one of the smartest ways to stretch a protein that was hard to come by. Eggs were precious, and when you had a few on hand, preserving them meant you could enjoy them over days instead of one single meal. The trick was in the brine. You took leftover beet juice, usually from canned or boiled beets, added vinegar and some spices, and dropped peeled boiled eggs into the jar. After a few days, they turned bright pink and took on a tangy, earthy flavor that was far more interesting than a plain boiled egg. The color made them feel like a treat, especially to children who had not seen anything festive in months. These were served at room temperature, sometimes sliced onto bread or mashed into sandwiches. They could last for over a week in a cool place, which made them ideal for families without ice boxes. They were flavorful, pretty to look at, and most importantly, long-lasting. Pickled beet eggs were one of those strange depression dishes that did not just make do, but made something new. So, back in the Depression, people used to get really into foraging. That also meant that they realized some of the stuff they were picking up, some of those berries, were pretty good for your skin, and I don't mean after you eat them. People would grind and mix these together to make their own little DIY beauty products. Having skincare like that in times like those was a big godsend for many people, and a lot of people used things like crushed flowers mixed with honey or berries for face masks or hair masks made out of eggs and essential oils. Molasses milk was poor man's cocoa, and for many families it was the closest thing to a sweet treat they could manage. All it took was a splash of hot milk, sometimes powdered, sometimes fresh, and a spoonful of molasses stirred in. The result was dark, rich, and full of iron, with a strong flavor that kids either loved or learned to tolerate. It had warmth, it had sweetness, and it came with none of the cost of chocolate, which had all but vanished from most households during the 1930s. Molasses was one of the most common sweeteners at the time because it was cheaper than sugar and had a longer shelf life. It also felt hearty, like something that was doing your body good, even if the cupboard was nearly empty. Some families drank this before bed. Others served it in place of breakfast. It was a quiet comfort, often ladled out in chipped mugs, handed off with a tired smile and a reminder to sip slowly. Molasses milk might not sound glamorous today, but back then, it tasted like safety. And that was worth more than anything else. Then, people were also spending a lot less on dainty, cute little jars off of Temu, Amazon, and online thrift stores. Any kind of packaging they had, they were reusing. Old pots that their grandmothers had, family heirlooms that had been passed down, and all sorts of other nifty ideas. Spending little money on storage was important back then, and it's important now too. As nice as it is to constantly have your phone ringing with a package on its way. Notification, maybe your bank account could breathe a little bit more if you reused a jar or three. Jelly omelets were the kind of oddball depression dish that worked better than expected. Eggs were easier to get than meat, especially if you had chickens, but they still had to stretch. So when there was no bacon or sausage, people got creative. They spread jam or jelly inside a folded omelet and served it like breakfast dessert. Grape, apple, strawberry, whatever you had, often homemade and preserved. It was sweet, soft, and oddly satisfying. The egg and sugar made something that felt like a treat, even if it was born of necessity. For children, it was special. For adults, it was just another way to avoid waste. You could swap in stewed fruit or mashed banana if jelly was gone. It was quick, flexible, and checked every box for a depression meal. It might seem strange today, but it made sense back then. When food was limited, taste mattered more than rules. Boiled salad dressing was the grandmother of everything that came before the grocery aisle. Back before bottled ranch or ready-made vinaigrettes, home cooks whipped up dressings from scratch using what they had in the pantry. This particular one was a little tangy, a little sweet, and usually started with vinegar, sugar, egg yolks, and a bit of mustard powder. Everything was whisked together in a saucepan and cooked low until it thickened like a custard. The result was creamy and tart, perfect for potato salad, coleslaw, or even spooned over hard-boiled eggs. Some versions added flour or cornstarch to help it hold better in the fridge, while others kept it simple. It might not have had the smooth pour of modern dressings, but it had soul and a flavor people still remember. You would find it tucked into the back pages of church cookbooks, labeled Grandma's Dressing or Sweet Egg Sauce. When chilled, it firmed up a little, which made it ideal for picnic salads that had to last in the summer sun. It tasted like resourcefulness. It tasted like memory. And it was surprisingly good. Grated raw potato pancakes were born out of pure necessity and just a little bit of grease. All you needed was a couple of raw potatoes, some flour to bind, an onion if you had it, and a hot skillet. Shred it all fine, press out the water, mix it together, and fry until golden. What came out was crispy at the edges, soft in the middle, and filling enough to count as breakfast, lunch, or dinner. These pancakes did not pretend to be fancy, they just showed up and got the job done. Potatoes were the backbone of many meals in the 1930s because they were cheap, lasted forever in storage, and grew in poor soil. You could trade for them, grow them, and feed a family for days with just a sack. These cakes were sometimes topped with applesauce or served alongside beans or eaten plain and hot off the pan. They were adaptable, frugal, and satisfying. A hot cake in a cold kitchen was enough to lift your spirits a bit. That crunch meant you were doing okay, at least for today. Another thing people would always do was to use scraps for soup. While you might be wondering why we would do this today because we don't have to go that frugal for our budgeting or soup, let's be real. A 2-bed costs $2,000 to rent, and that money isn't coming from a minimum wage shift at Wendy's. Using scraps for soup can still work even in our time because we can use it as a way to repurpose leftovers, a lot like what people did during the Depression, actually. Pickled beet eggs looked almost too strange to eat, but they were one of the smartest ways to stretch a protein that was hard to come by. Eggs were precious, and when you had a few on hand, preserving them meant you could enjoy them over days instead of one single meal. The trick was in the brine. You took leftover beet juice, usually from canned or boiled beets, added vinegar and some spices, and dropped peeled boiled eggs into the jar. After a few days, they turned bright pink and took on a tangy, earthy flavor that was far more interesting than a plain boiled egg. The color made them feel like a treat, especially to children who had not seen anything festive in months. These were served at room temperature, sometimes sliced onto bread or mashed into sandwiches. They could last for over a week in a cool place, which made them ideal for families without ice boxes. They were flavorful, pretty to look at, and most importantly, long-lasting. Pickled beet eggs were one of those strange Depression dishes that did not just make do, but made something new. Old-fashioned corn pudding was sweet, soft, and surprisingly hearty, especially for something that came from such humble beginnings. In the 1930s, cornmeal was dirt cheap and endlessly useful, and this dish was one of the cleverest ways to turn it into a filling side, a bit of cornmeal, water or milk, and just enough sugar to make it feel special. Eggs were sometimes added, but often it was just flour, grease, and corn. It came out like a custard or a thick bread pudding, depending on what you had. Baked slowly, it developed a crust on top and a warm, spoonable inside that made it a family favorite. People would eat it hot out of the oven or cold the next morning, sometimes drizzled with molasses or a pat of margarine. It was both side dish and dessert, depending on your mood. There were no store-bought sweets for most folks back then, so corn pudding gave just enough sugar and softness to count as a treat. And for children, it was a rare bite of comfort in a world where food often felt like medicine. It was poor man's pudding, but it tasted like something richer. Vinegar pie filling thickener was one of those odd tricks that worked better than it had any right to. Older fruit pies often came out runny, too sweet, or flat. A splash of vinegar helped in two ways. First, it cut the sugary taste and brought the fruit's brightness back. Second, it helped the flour or starch bind the filling together. Some even said it helped fruit hold its shape. You saw this most in old apple or berry pies, where just a teaspoon gave the flavor a sharp little kick. It was not something most people noticed, but if it was missing, you could tell. The sharp smell faded in the oven, leaving behind something more balanced. A clean slice, no leaks. Some tricks are bold. This one just did its job, and did it well. Hardtack with gravy was a way of reviving something almost too tough to chew into something soft and sustaining. Hardtack, that old sailor's biscuit made of just flour and water, was shelf-stable and cheap. You could find it in army rations and emergency pantries, and in the Great Depression, people brought it back out of necessity. By itself, it was like biting into a brick. But soak it in milk or water, then smother it in gravy or fat, and suddenly you had something warm and edible. The gravy could be made from bacon drippings, flour, and whatever seasonings you had on hand. Sometimes people would stir in bits of onion or mashed beans to bulk it out. The result was soft, salty, and just enough like dinner to satisfy. Kids might not have loved it, but they learned to eat it fast. It filled you up and made good use of food that was meant to last forever. In hard times, that mattered. Hardtack with gravy was a lesson in patience, in chewing, and in making do with what you had, even if what you had was practically stone. Wilted lettuce salad was not just about saving soggy greens. It was about making the most of what the garden gave, even past its prime. When lettuce started to wilt in the heat or after a few days indoors, families did not toss it. Instead, they poured hot bacon grease mixed with vinegar over the top, reviving the leaves into something tender and flavorful. The heat wilted the lettuce just enough, and the vinegar gave it a punch of brightness. Bits of onion or crumbled bacon were added when possible, but the core of the dish was that sizzling pour. It turned tired lettuce into a warm salad with more depth than any cold dressing could offer. You did not need much to make it feel special. It was a moment when something old felt new again. In a time of extreme frugality, it captured the mindset perfectly. Do not throw it out. Just use it differently. Wilted lettuce was not a fallback. It was a quiet trick that helped people feel like they still had a choice at the table. People also used to make their own makeshift DIY cleaning products out of baking soda and vinegar. If you have a cat, you might actually be familiar with this if you've ever dealt with their awful bladder control. Turns out, the two together actually make for a pretty decent detergent, and if you ever find yourself out of some cleaning products or just don't feel like going to the store and you can't order, it's always good to make some at home. It helps you save just a little bit more on the groceries while teaching you a resourceful little skill. Ketchup sandwiches were not a joke back then. They were survival. 2 slices of white bread, a squeeze of ketchup, and that was lunch. When fresh tomatoes were too expensive or gone altogether, the bottle stood in. It was cheap, it was sweet, and it gave just enough tang to fool your brain into thinking you had a real sandwich. Sometimes people would add onions or pickles if they had them, but most of the time it was just the red stuff and bread. And you would be surprised how many kids looked forward to it. It was bright, flavorful, and in a decade where most meals were beige, that mattered more than you would think. Ketchup was a staple condiment because it had a long shelf life and could cover the taste of anything going off. In this case, it became the main event. Parents handed it out with a smile, even if their hearts sank doing it. It was food, and that counted. You might laugh at it today, but in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches were a reminder that even when the pantry was bare, you could still pretend to eat like everyone else. Gelatin mold leftover savor might sound like a punishment today, but back then, it was a point of pride. Once gelatin became affordable and easy to prepare, people found all kinds of ways to use it, especially as a vessel to stretch meals and make use of leftovers. You had a little ham, some canned peas, a scoop of last night's macaroni salad. Mix it all into lemon or tomato gelatin and pour it into a mold. Chill, unmold, and suddenly you had a centerpiece. It was cold. It was colorful. It was the future, or so they said. These savory gelatin molds were featured everywhere from homemaker magazines to government-sponsored nutrition guides. They promised frugality, beauty, and innovation all in one jiggly dish. Housewives with limited means could make a full meal look polished and party-ready. People even had specific molds for specific meals. Rings, domes, fish shapes, you name it. It may not have always tasted great, but it looked impressive. And that counted for something. Somewhere between waste, not, and show-off, gelatin found its niche. Molasses milk was poor man's cocoa, and for many families it was the closest thing to a sweet treat they could manage. All it took was a splash of hot milk, sometimes powdered, sometimes fresh, and a spoonful of molasses stirred in. The result was dark, rich, and full of iron, with a strong flavor that kids either loved or learned to tolerate. It had warmth, it had sweetness, and it came with none of the cost of chocolate, which had all but vanished from most households during the 1930s. Molasses was one of the most common sweeteners at the time because it was cheaper than sugar and had a longer shelf life. It also felt hearty, like something that was doing your body good, even if the cupboard was nearly empty. Some families drank this before bed. Others served it in place of breakfast. It was a quiet comfort, often ladled out in chipped mugs, handed off with a tired smile and a reminder to sip slowly. Molasses milk might not sound glamorous today, but back then, it tasted like safety. And that was worth more than anything else. Old-fashioned corn pudding was sweet, soft, and surprisingly hearty, especially for something that came from such humble beginnings. In the 1930s, cornmeal was dirt cheap and endlessly useful, and this dish was one of the cleverest ways to turn it into a filling side, a bit of cornmeal, water or milk, and just enough sugar to make it feel special. Eggs were sometimes added, but often it was just flour, grease, and corn. It came out like a custard or a thick bread pudding, depending on what you had. Baked slowly, it developed a crust on top and a warm, spoonable inside that made it a family favorite. People would eat it hot out of the oven or cold the next morning, sometimes drizzled with molasses or a pat of margarine. It was both side dish and dessert, depending on your mood. There were no store-bought sweets for most folks back then, so corn pudding gave just enough sugar and softness to count as a treat. And for children, it was a rare bite of comfort in a world where food often felt like medicine. It was poor man's pudding, but it tasted like something richer. Breadcrumb stuffing without meat was not just a holiday thing in the 1930s, it was a year-round filler. When families had no sausage, no giblets, and sometimes no roast at all, they would take stale bread, tear it up, and moisten it with water or broth. If you had a little onion or celery, that went in too. The whole mess got baked until crisp on top and soft inside, and it tasted like something far fancier than it was. This was depression cooking at its cleverest. The trick was to use whatever you had to stretch the meal. Sometimes the bread was barely held together with a bit of egg or flour paste. Sometimes it was just bread, salt, and hope. But it filled bellies, and that was what mattered most. People called it stuffing, even if there was nothing to stuff. It would sit in the center of the table like a roast if need be. Some families even sliced it cold the next day and fried it up like savory cake. It was warm, it was simple, and it helped people feel like they still had something special to share. That was the magic of it. Plain food pretending to be more. Coffee can bread baking was born out of pure practicality, but it somehow felt a little magical too. If you had a clean empty can, anywhere from an old coffee tin to a leftover fruit cocktail can, you had yourself a bread pan. These cans were used for everything from banana bread to steamed Boston brown bread, and they gave each loaf that tall, round look you could not get from a standard pan. The inside of the can would be greased with bacon fat or butter, filled partway with dough, and then either baked or steamed depending on the recipe. The end result was a soft, rich bread with a golden crust and a shape that stood proud on the plate. Some cans were even reused again and again, passed down like family heirlooms, with their dents and scratches telling their own story. And when the bread came out, kids always thought it looked a little like cake. So of course it disappeared in minutes. Old cookbooks called these canned loaves or pantry tins, and for good reason. You made do with what you had, and the results were better than expected. Coffee cans made perfect pans, and no one thought twice about it. Rice-stuffed baked apples were one of those meals that towed the line between dinner and dessert. Apples stored well through winter, and rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook. Together, they made something practical and gently sweet. You hollowed an apple, stuffed it with cooked rice, and baked it until it softened and started to collapse. If you had cinnamon or brown sugar, great. If not, a pat of lard did the trick. Some added milk to make it creamier. It was not fancy or meant to impress, but it filled stomachs and made children smile. In a time where smiles were hard to come by, that counted. These apples were often served after a bowl of soup or beans as a way to end on something soft. They warmed the kitchen and reminded folks that even hard times had gentle endings. Grated raw potato pancakes were born out of pure necessity and just a little bit of grease. All you needed was a couple of raw potatoes, some flour to bind, an onion if you had it, and a hot skillet. Shred it all fine, press out the water, mix it together, and fry until golden. What came out was crispy at the edges, soft in the middle, and filling enough to count as breakfast, lunch, or dinner. These pancakes did not pretend to be fancy, they just showed up and got the job done. Potatoes were the backbone of many meals in the 1930s because they were cheap, lasted forever in storage, and grew in poor soil. You could trade for them, grow them, and feed a family for days with just a sack. These cakes were sometimes topped with applesauce or served alongside beans or eaten plain and hot off the pan. They were adaptable, frugal, and satisfying. A hot cake in a cold kitchen was enough to lift your spirits a bit. That crunch meant you were doing okay, at least for today. Also, people would use leftover coffee grounds to naturally cleanse their home of any kind of odor. See, the thing you probably don't know about coffee grounds is that they actually work extremely well as a natural deodorizer. While the appeal of having a mix of every scent known to man being available to you at the tap of a phone is pretty neat, it doesn't really help you get your money up. If that's what you're interested in, maybe you could buy the cheap can of air freshener, keep those windows open, and reuse your coffee grounds before you throw them around. By the way, they make great compost too. Lima bean stew was one of those one-pot miracles that got families through the leanest stretches of the 1930s. Dried lima beans were cheap, easy to store, and when soaked and cooked slowly, they turned creamy and rich. Families would simmer them all day with scraps of carrot, onion, or potato, whatever they could find. If they had bacon grease or lard, a spoonful added body. If not, salt and thyme would do the job. There was no recipe, just instinct and adaptation. Sometimes the beans were mashed into a thick paste, sometimes left whole and floating in broth. The stew could stretch over 2 or even 3 days, especially if you kept adding water or leftover vegetables. Kids might complain, but mothers knew. This pot was the difference between full and hungry. In many homes, the smell of beans bubbling away was a kind of comfort. It meant there would be something to eat tonight. It was frugal food with just enough warmth to feel like dinner. In hard times, lima bean stew taught you patience, resourcefulness, and the power of cooking what you had, not what you wished for. Mayonnaise as a cake moistener sounds like a cruel joke until you taste it. In the lean years, especially during the Great Depression and into the war era, people had to get creative when they were short on eggs, milk, or butter. Mayonnaise was made with all three, and it had a smooth, fatty texture that blended beautifully into batter. So when folks wanted to bake a cake but the fridge was bare, they reached for the mayo jar. Chocolate mayonnaise cake became a sleeper hit, especially in mid-century kitchens. It was rich, dark, and impossibly moist, with a texture that stayed soft even days after baking. Cookbooks started including mayo cakes as their own category, with variations that included nuts, cinnamon, or even applesauce. Brands caught on too. Some even printed the recipe on the side of their jars. You could always tell someone grew up during hard times if they looked at a cake and guessed the secret ingredient right away. To this day, some home bakers still swear it is the only way to make a chocolate cake that never dries out. Strange as it sounds, mayonnaise made cakes better, and no one questioned it. Wilted lettuce salad was not just about saving soggy greens. It was about making the most of what the garden gave, even past its prime. When lettuce started to wilt in the heat or after a few days indoors, families did not toss it. Instead, they poured hot bacon grease mixed with vinegar over the top, reviving the leaves into something tender and flavorful. The heat wilted the lettuce just enough, and the vinegar gave it a punch of brightness. Bits of onion or crumbled bacon were added when possible, but the core of the dish was that sizzling pour. It turned tired lettuce into a warm salad with more depth than any cold dressing could offer. You did not need much to make it feel special. It was a moment when something old felt new again. In a time of extreme frugality, it captured the mindset perfectly. Do not throw it out. Just use it differently. Wilted lettuce was not a fallback. It was a quiet trick that helped people feel like they still had a choice at the table. Drop your favorite trick in the comments. Tap like if you learned something new, and hit subscribe to keep these old kitchen secrets cooking.